In the scorching heat of a West Texas morning in August 1905, three identical girls were discovered wandering alone in the vast emptiness of the Chihuahuan Desert. They appeared to be 12 years old, with identical pale skin that seemed untouched by the brutal sun, identical raven black hair braided in precisely the same pattern, and identical dark eyes that reflected light in ways that made grown men uncomfortable. But what made Sheriff Marcus Webb's blood run cold wasn't their appearance. It was the way they spoke. Every word came from all three mouths simultaneously, in perfect unison, as if controlled by a single mind. When asked their names, they replied in eerie harmony, "We are the children of the between places." When asked where they came from, their synchronized response chilled everyone who heard it. "We come from when the world forgets to watch." For over a century, this case has been buried in the dusty archives of Brewster County, too disturbing for authorities to publicize, too impossible for historians to believe. Tonight, we reveal the full truth about three children who shouldn't have existed, whose presence defied every law of nature and reason, and whose ultimate fate remains one of the most terrifying mysteries in American history. Before we journey into this abyss of the impossible, this channel isn't for the faint of heart. We uncover the mysteries that powerful forces tried to erase from history forever. If you're brave enough to confront truths that challenge everything you believe about reality, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state you're watching from. Are you ready to question the very nature of existence itself? What makes this case particularly horrifying is that it wasn't the product of folklore or superstition, but documented fact witnessed by educated professionals who staked their reputations on testimony that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In 1905, the frontier was still a place where civilization's grip remained tenuous, where the vast expanses of West Texas could swallow entire communities without a trace, and where the line between the possible and impossible blurred like heat mirages dancing across the desert floor. Sheriff Marcus Webb had seen everything the frontier could offer during his 15 years enforcing law in Brewster County. He'd tracked down cattle rustlers through Apache territory, investigated murders that would make city detectives sick, and confronted the kind of human evil that thrives in places where civilization's light barely penetrates. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the telegram that arrived at his office on August 15th, 1905. Samuel Cartwright, a respected cattle rancher whose spread covered nearly 50,000 acres of the harshest terrain in West Texas, had sent an urgent message that defied comprehension. Found three children in desert. Something wrong with them. Come. Immediately. Bring doctor if possible. Webb knew Cartwright as a man who measured his words carefully, someone who understood the difference between unusual and impossible. If Sam Cartwright claimed something was wrong, it demanded immediate investigation. The sheriff gathered his deputy and set out across the baking desert toward the Cartwright Ranch, a journey that would take them 6 hours through terrain that could kill the unprepared. When they arrived at the ranch house just after sunset, they found Cartwright sitting on his front porch with his rifle across his knees, staring out at the desert with the hollow eyes of a man who had seen something that challenged his understanding of the world. The rancher was a giant of a man, weathered by decades of frontier life, but his hands shook as he pointed toward a small outbuilding where he had placed the children. "Sheriff," Cartwright said in a voice barely above a whisper, "I've been ranching this land for 23 years. I've seen drought, flood, Apache raids, and things that would turn a preacher's hair white. But those children in there, they ain't natural." The three girls sat motionless on wooden crates in the dim interior of the storage shed, illuminated by a single oil lamp that cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. They were positioned exactly 3 feet apart in a perfect triangular formation, their hands folded identically in their laps, their heads tilted at precisely the same angle. When Sheriff Webb entered, all three turned their heads toward him with mechanical synchronization that made his skin crawl. Their dresses were identical, simple gray cotton garments that appeared handmade but crafted from fabric unlike anything Webb had seen in local stores. The material had an unusual sheen that seemed to shimmer despite the dim light, and the stitching followed patterns that hurt to look at directly, creating optical illusions that made the eye want to slide away. "What are "Your names?" Sheriff Webb asked, crouching down to bring himself to their eye level. The response came from all three simultaneously, their voices blending into a single eerie harmony. "We are the daughters of the space between heartbeats." Webb felt ice form in his stomach despite the oppressive heat. "Where are your parents?" Again, the synchronized response. "They sleep in the place where yesterday meets tomorrow." Deputy Harrison, a young man fresh from the relative civilization of San Antonio, backed toward the door. "Sheriff," he whispered urgently, "this ain't right. Children don't talk like that." But Webb pressed on, his lawman's instincts overriding his growing fear. "How did you get here? How long have you been walking?" The girl's dark eyes seemed to focus on something beyond the visible world as they spoke in their unsettling unison. "We have always been walking. We will always be walking. Time is a circle that forgot how to close." Cartwright's voice came from the doorway. "Sheriff, that's not the strangest part. Tell him about the photographs, girls." Webb looked back at the rancher in confusion, but before he could ask what photographs meant, something even more disturbing occurred. All three girls began to hum simultaneously, not a melody he recognized, but a haunting harmony that seemed to make the air itself vibrate. The sound was beautiful and terrible, like distant church bells mixed with the cries of dying animals. As the humming continued, the oil lamp began to flicker despite the absence of any wind. The shadows on the walls started moving independently of their sources, writhing and dancing in patterns that suggested shapes too horrible to fully perceive. Webb felt a pressure in his ears like diving deep underwater, and the temperature in the shed dropped noticeably despite the August heat. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the humming stopped. The lamp steadied. The shadows returned to their proper places. The girls sat, motionless again, staring at some invisible point in the middle distance. "Jesus Christ," Deputy Harrison breathed, making the sign of the cross. Sheriff Webb stood slowly, his mind racing to process what he had witnessed. These weren't lost children. They were something else entirely, something that didn't belong in the natural world he thought he understood. Dr. Eleanor Hartfield arrived at the Cartwright Ranch the following morning, having traveled through the night from Alpine after receiving Sheriff Webb's urgent telegram. As one of the few physicians in West Texas with formal medical training from Johns Hopkins, she brought a scientific approach to mysteries that others might dismiss as supernatural nonsense. Her reputation for rational thinking and meticulous documentation had made her the go-to medical authority for unusual cases across 3 counties. Dr. Hartfield was a woman of 35 who had shocked polite society by pursuing medicine instead of marriage, carrying herself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to having her expertise questioned and her conclusions doubted. She had seen cases of hysteria, mental illness, and neurological disorders that local folk attributed to witchcraft or divine punishment. But nothing had prepared her for her first encounter with the 3 identical girls. The moment she entered the shed where they remained seated in their perfect triangular formation, Dr. Hartfield felt an immediate physical reaction that defied medical explanation. Her pulse accelerated despite her calm demeanor, and she experienced a sensation of vertigo that had nothing to do with the oppressive heat. The children's synchronized gaze seemed to penetrate not just her eyes but her very thoughts. "Good morning, girls," she said in the gentle tone she used with frightened patience. "I'm Dr. Hartfield. I'd like to examine you to make sure you're healthy." The response came in their eerie unison. "We know why you have come, Lady of Healing. You seek to measure what cannot be measured." Dr. Hartfield felt her scientific confidence waver for a moment before reasserting itself. These children were clearly disturbed, possibly suffering from shared psychosis or the effects of prolonged exposure and malnutrition. She began her examination with the girl on the left, checking pulse, breathing, and basic neurological responses. What she discovered challenged every principle of medical science she had learned. The child's pulse was exactly 60 beats per minute, not approximately but precisely, as if regulated by clockwork. Her breathing was similarly controlled, 12 breaths per minute, each inhalation and exhalation identical in duration and depth. Most disturbing of all, when Dr. Hartfield checked the pulse of the second girl, she found exactly the same rate and rhythm, not similar but identical down to the smallest variation. "That's impossible," she muttered, moving to the third child. The pulse was again exactly 60 beats per minute, synchronized perfectly with her sister's. When she checked all three simultaneously, she discovered that their heartbeats were not merely the same rate, but beating in perfect unison, as if they shared a single cardiovascular system. Dr. Hartfield's examination revealed other anomalies that defied rational explanation. All three girls bore identical scars on their left shoulders, small circular marks that appeared surgical in nature, but showed signs of being decades old despite the children's apparent age. Their eyes reflected light with an unusual intensity, creating a subtle luminescence that was visible even in daylight. Most unsettling was their synchronized responses to medical stimuli. When Dr. Hartfield tested reflexes on one child, all three reacted identically and simultaneously. A pinprick on one girl's finger caused all three to flinch at exactly the same moment. When she checked the throat of the middle child with a tongue depressor, the other two opened their mouths and said, "Ah," without being asked. "Sheriff Webb," Dr. Hartfield called urgently, "I need to speak with you privately." Outside the shed, away from the children's unsettling presence, she struggled to maintain her professional composure. These children are not merely identical, they appear to share physiological responses in ways that violate basic medical understanding. It's as if they're three parts of a single organism rather than separate individuals. Webb nodded grimly. "Doc, there's something else. We've sent telegrams to every sheriff, marshal, and peace officer within 300 miles. Nobody's reported missing children matching their description. It's like they just appeared out of nowhere." Dr. Hartfield pulled out her notebook and began recording observations with the meticulous detail that characterized all her work. The children's synchronized behavior, their identical physiological responses, and their impossible knowledge of things they shouldn't know suggested either an elaborate hoax or something that challenged the fundamental assumptions of medical science. As the afternoon wore on, more disturbing patterns emerged. The girls seemed to know things they had no way of knowing. The names of people they'd never met, details about local history that even longtime residents had forgotten, and most unnervingly, they appeared to anticipate questions before they were asked. When Sheriff Webb mentioned he was thinking about sending for help from federal authorities, the girls spoke in unison without being addressed. "The men with badges from the far place will come when the sun dies 3 more times. They will bring the box that steals shadows." Webb and Dr. Hartfield exchanged alarmed glances. Neither had mentioned anything about photography equipment, but the girls' reference to a box that steals shadows suggested they somehow knew about the camera that was being shipped from San Antonio at Webb's request. That evening, as Dr. Hartfield prepared her initial medical report, she found herself struggling with language to describe phenomena that had no medical precedent. How could she document synchronized heartbeats, shared reflexes, and apparent telepathic abilities in terms that wouldn't destroy her professional credibility? James Morrison arrived in Brewster County on August 18 with his wagon loaded with the finest photographic equipment money could buy. As one of the Southwest's most respected documentary photographers, he had spent 5 years capturing the dying frontier for Eastern newspapers and magazines. His portfolio included images of Apache warriors, cattle drives, mining camps, and the harsh beauty of landscapes that were rapidly disappearing as civilization pushed westward. Morrison was a meticulous craftsman who took pride in the technical perfection of his work. He used only the finest German lenses, the most sensitive photographic plates and chemicals mixed according to precise formulas that ensured consistent results. In 5 years of frontier photography, he had never produced an image that wasn't sharp, properly exposed, and accurately representative of his subjects. Sheriff Webb had summoned Morrison to create a photographic record of the three mysterious girls, hoping that images might help identify them or provide evidence of their origins. The photographer arrived with high expectations of producing the kind of clear documentation that had made his reputation throughout the territory. Setting up his equipment in the shade of the ranch house, Morrison arranged his camera with the practiced efficiency of years of experience. He positioned his tripod, checked his focus through the ground glass viewer, and prepared photographic plates with the careful attention to detail that distinguished professional work from amateur attempts. "Sheriff," Morrison called, "if you'll bring the children out, I'll have this documentation completed within the hour." When the three girls emerged from the shed, still moving with their unnerving synchronization, Morrison felt the first hint that this assignment might prove unusual. Through his camera's viewfinder, the children appeared somehow different, less solid, as if the camera was having difficulty capturing their essence. He made his first exposure using standard settings that had never failed him before: appropriate aperture for the available light, sufficient shutter speed to prevent motion blur, and fresh photographic plates that had been tested just days before. The children stood motionless during the long exposure, their identical poses held with supernatural steadiness. When Morrison developed the plate in his portable darkroom, he discovered something that challenged 20 years of photographic experience. The image showed the ranch house background in perfect detail, every board and nail rendered with crystalline clarity. But where the three girls should have appeared, there were only vague, blurred shapes that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. "That's impossible," Morrison muttered, examining the negative with a magnifying glass. The blur wasn't random. It showed a deliberate pattern, as if the girls were moving during exposure despite their obvious stillness. He prepared a second plate, this time using twice the normal exposure time to ensure adequate light capture. Again, the background appeared, in perfect focus, while the children manifested as indistinct shapes that hurt to examine closely. The longer exposure had somehow made the effect worse, creating ghostly impressions that seemed to move independently of any logical photographic process. Morrison tried different lenses, various exposure times, and even different camera positions. Each attempt produced the same impossible result: perfect background clarity with subjects that appeared as shifting, translucent phantoms. Most disturbing was the discovery that the distortions seemed to follow no known optical principles. Sometimes the girls appeared as dark shadows, sometimes as bright spots, and occasionally as shapes that seemed to extend beyond the boundaries of normal three-dimensional space. "Sheriff Webb," Morrison called urgently, "I need to test something. Can you stand next to the children for comparison?" When Webb positioned himself beside the three girls, the resulting photograph showed him in perfect detail while they remained as undefined smears of light and shadow. The contrast was so stark it appeared to be the result of deliberate manipulation rather than a photographic anomaly. Dr. Hartfield, observing the experiment with growing fascination, requested her own test. "Mr. Morrison, could you photograph just the children's hands? Perhaps the effect is related to facial features or body size." The close-up attempt produced the most disturbing result yet. The girls' hands appeared as writhing, tentacle-like appendages that seemed to reach beyond the photographic frame. The image suggested movement that was impossible given the subject's obvious stillness, creating optical illusions that made the viewer feel nauseous when examined directly. Morrison, his professional confidence thoroughly shattered, attempted one final experiment. He positioned a wooden chair next to the children and asked one of them to place her hand on it. The resulting photograph showed the chair in perfect detail, complete with wood grain and nail holes, but where the girl's hand touched the surface, the image became distorted as if viewed through water or thick glass. 20 years I've been taking photographs," Morrison said, his voice shaking as he examined the latest impossible image. "I've photographed everything from presidential portraits to battlefield carnage. I've never seen anything that my camera couldn't capture accurately." The photographer's documentation attempts continued for 3 days, each experiment producing results that violated the fundamental principles of optics and chemistry. Different cameras, various lenses, multiple film types, and even attempts with different lighting conditions all yielded the same impossible outcome. The three girls could not be photographed normally. Most unnerving was Morrison's discovery that the photographic anomalies seemed to be getting worse over time. His first attempts had produced blurred but recognizable human shapes. By the third day, the images showed distortions so severe they appeared almost demonic. Twisted forms that suggested shapes no human eye should witness. The girls themselves remained serenely untroubled by the photographic failures. When asked about their inability to be captured on film, they responded in their eerie unison. Shadows flee from those who cast no reflection in time's mirror. Morrison packed his equipment with hands that trembled from more than just the desert heat. In his detailed notes, he wrote, "I can only conclude that either my entire understanding of photographic science is fundamentally flawed, or these children represent something that exists outside the normal laws of physics. Given my 20 years of successful practice, I am forced to consider the latter possibility, despite its implications for everything I believe about the nature of reality." The failed photographic documentation marked a turning point in the investigation. What had begun as a search for missing children had become an encounter with something that challenged the very foundations of scientific understanding. The three girls who could not be captured by cameras were clearly not ordinary children, but what they actually were remained a mystery that grew more terrifying with each attempt to solve it. Reverend Thomas Blackwood arrived at the Cartwright Ranch on August 19th, summoned by Sheriff Webb's increasingly desperate telegrams requesting assistance from anyone with expertise in unusual spiritual matters. As the circuit preacher for 3 counties and a scholar of ancient languages trained at Princeton Seminary, Blackwood brought both theological authority and academic rigor to mysteries that defied conventional explanation. The 47-year-old minister had encountered what frontier communities called spiritual disturbances throughout his 15 years of service in West Texas. He had performed exorcisms on settlers convinced they were possessed, investigated reports of ghostly apparitions in abandoned mining camps, and counseled families who believed their land was cursed. In every case, he had found rational explanations rooted in mental illness, environmental factors, or simple superstition. But his first encounter with the 3 identical girls shattered his confidence in rational theology as completely as it had destroyed Dr. Hartfield's faith in medical science. When Reverend Blackwood approached the shed, carrying his leather-bound Bible and silver crucifix, the children's reaction was immediate and violent. All 3 began convulsing simultaneously, their synchronized screams creating harmonics that made the wooden walls vibrate. The temperature in the shed dropped 20 degrees in seconds, and the oil lamp flame turned from yellow to an unnatural blue that cast sickening shadows on the rough-hewn walls. "In the name of Jesus Christ," Blackwood commanded, raising his crucifix, "I compel you to be still." The effect was the opposite of what he expected. The girls' convulsions intensified, and their screams shifted into what he recognized with growing horror as perfect recitations of biblical passages, but spoken in ancient Aramaic, Hebrew, and Greek languages that no 12-year-old frontier children could possibly know. More disturbing still, they were reciting texts that had been deliberately excluded from the canonical Bible, apocryphal passages that existed only in theological archives and scholarly translations. Their pronunciation was flawless, their understanding of complex theological concepts demonstrated through inflection and emphasis that revealed deep comprehension of meanings that escaped most seminary graduates. And the watchers descended to corrupt the daughters of men. They chanted in perfect unison, their voices blending into harmonics that hurt to hear. "And their children shall be as bridges between the worlds that are and the worlds that should not be." Reverend Blackwood's hands trembled as he recognized the passage from the Book of Enoch, a text so obscure that he had encountered it only once during advanced theological studies. These children were not merely reciting memorized words. They were demonstrating understanding of concepts that challenge Orthodox Christianity. When he attempted to enter the shed completely, the girls' chanting reached a crescendo that shattered the oil lamp's glass chimney. In the sudden darkness, their voices continued with terrifying clarity. "The shepherd of souls cannot enter where the flock has forgotten how to be shepherded." Blackwood retreated, his theological certainty crumbling as he tried to process what he had witnessed. These children displayed knowledge that violated every principle of spiritual authority he had learned. They spoke ancient languages with native fluency, quoted texts that existed only in the most specialized academic collections, and demonstrated theological understanding that surpassed his own seminary education. That evening, he spent hours in fervent prayer and frantic research through his personal theological library. What he discovered in his books about historical accounts of similar phenomena filled him with a dread that made sleep impossible. Samuel Cartwright had been withholding crucial details about the discovery of the three girls, details so disturbing that he feared no one would believe him. But as the investigation intensified and more impossible evidence accumulated, he realized that his complete testimony might be essential to understanding the true nature of what they faced. On the evening of August 20th, Cartwright finally revealed the full circumstances of his discovery to Sheriff Webb, Dr. Hartfield, Morrison, and Reverend Blackwood. His account, delivered in the halting voice of a man reliving a nightmare, painted a picture even more terrifying than they had imagined. "I found them just before dawn on August 15th, Cartwright began, his weathered hands gripping a whiskey glass that trembled despite his effort to remain steady. "But that ain't the whole truth. I'd been hearing things for 3 nights before that. Sounds coming from the dead center of the desert that made my cattle restless and my horses refused to leave the barn. The sounds," he explained, "were unlike anything in nature. A low humming that seemed to emanate from underground, punctuated by what could only be described as the earth itself breathing." On the 3rd night, unable to sleep, he had ridden out to investigate despite every instinct screaming at him to stay away. "When I got to the source of the sounds about 5 miles from the house, I found something that still makes my hands shake," Cartwright continued. "There was a perfect circle burned into the desert floor, maybe 30 feet across. Nothing grew in that circle. Not a single blade of grass, not even the hardiest desert weeds. The ground was black like it, had been scorched, but there was no ash, no smell of fire. At the exact center of this circle, the 3 girls sat in their triangular formation, perfectly motionless in the pre-dawn darkness. They were not sleeping, not moving, just sitting with their eyes closed and their faces turned upward toward the stars. Most unsettling of all, they appeared to be glowing with a faint luminescence that had nothing to do with reflected moonlight. They'd been sitting there for hours, maybe all night," Cartwright said. "The ground around them was stone cold despite the August heat, and my horse wouldn't go within 50 feet of that circle. When the sun came up and they opened their eyes, all 3 looked directly at me and spoke in that unnatural unison. 'The finder of the lost has found what should not be found.'" Cartwright had approached carefully, his rancher's instincts telling him these were no ordinary lost children. There were no footprints leading to the circle, no signs of how they had arrived, and no evidence of camping or shelter. Most disturbing of all, when he touched the burned ground, it felt warm despite the cool morning air, as if some invisible fire continued burning beneath the surface. "I brought them back to the ranch because leaving them there felt wrong," he admitted. "But I've regretted that decision every moment since. The cattle won't graze anywhere near that burned circle, and I've lost 12 head that just wandered off and never came back. Something about those girls is poisoning the land itself." The rancher's complete account revealed additional details that explained some of the investigation's strange discoveries. The children had never asked for food or water, never showed signs of fatigue, and never seemed to sleep. When he had checked on them during the first night, he found them sitting motionless in the shed, their eyes open and reflecting light like nocturnal animals. "Sheriff," Cartwright concluded, "I've been working this land for over 20 years. I know what belongs here and what doesn't. Those children don't belong anywhere in this world." Miss Catherine Wells arrived from the county school district on August 21st, called in by Sheriff Webb to assess the children's educational needs and determine their approximate age and background through academic testing. As one of the few certified teachers in West Texas with formal training from a normal school in Kansas, she brought systematic pedagogical methods to a mystery that had already baffled medical, legal, and religious authorities. Miss Wells was a practical woman of 28 who had spent 5 years educating frontier children under conditions that would challenge the most dedicated educator. She had taught students who spoke only Spanish, Apache children forced into English language schools, and immigrant families whose educational backgrounds varied wildly. Her experience with diverse learning situations had taught her to recognize intelligence regardless of its cultural packaging, but nothing had prepared her for students who demonstrated knowledge they had never been taught. Setting up a makeshift classroom in the ranch house parlor, Miss Wells began with basic assessments designed to determine reading level, mathematical comprehension, and general educational background. Her first test involved simple arithmetic problems that would typically challenge 12-year-old students. The girl's response defied every principle of educational psychology she had learned. Without hesitation or consultation among themselves, all three began solving complex mathematical equations that she hadn't yet presented, working through problems involving advanced algebra and geometric principles that weren't taught until university level. "How do you know these mathematical concepts?" Miss Wells asked, her voice tight with disbelief. Their synchronized response came in perfect unison. "Numbers are the language that reality speaks to itself. We have always understood the conversation." Miss Wells tried simpler tests, presenting basic reading exercises suitable for children their apparent age. The girls read the passages flawlessly, but then began reciting additional text that didn't exist on the pages, completing stories, adding chapters, and demonstrating intimate knowledge of literary works they had never encountered. When she tested their geographical knowledge, they provided detailed descriptions of places that didn't exist on any map, speaking of cities with names that hurt to hear, and describing landscapes that violated natural law. Their knowledge seemed to encompass not just what was, but what could be and what should never be. Most disturbing were the writing exercises. When asked to compose simple sentences, all three wrote identical responses simultaneously. Their handwriting so perfectly matched, it appeared to be the work of a single person. But the content of their writing revealed understanding of concepts that transcended normal education. They wrote about the spaces between seconds where lost thoughts gather, and the libraries that exist in the margins of dreams. Their compositions demonstrated literary sophistication that would challenge university graduates, combined with knowledge of subjects that didn't exist in any curriculum. Miss Wells's final experiment proved the most unsettling. She separated the girls into different rooms and asked each to write about their earliest memory. Despite being isolated from each other, all three produced identical accounts describing impossible events. "We remember the moment when silence learned to speak. We remember when darkness decided to dream of light. We remember being born from the echo of a song that was never sung." The educational assessment that should have taken hours to complete revealed in minutes that these children possessed knowledge that transcended normal human learning. They understood concepts that existed only in the most advanced academic theories, spoke languages that belonged to dead civilizations, and demonstrated awareness of information that shouldn't have existed in any earthly curriculum. Reverend Blackwood's research into church archives yielded discoveries that transformed the investigation from a local mystery into something with implications that reach back through generations. Working through the night in his study, surrounded by theological texts and historical documents, he uncovered patterns that suggested the three girls were not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a recurring cycle that spanned decades. The first reference he found was buried in a collection of mission reports from 1855, exactly 50 years earlier. Father Miguel Santos, a Catholic priest working with Apache tribes near El Paso, had documented the discovery of three identical girls found in the desert under circumstances that perfectly matched the current situation. The children spoke in unison, demonstrated impossible knowledge, and could not be photographed using the primitive daguerreotype equipment available at the time. Father Santos's account described the girls' inability to enter consecrated ground, their knowledge of ancient languages, and their eventual disappearance after exactly 30 days. Most chilling was his final entry. "These children are not of this world, but they serve as harbingers of something that approaches from the spaces between spaces. God help us all when they return." Digging deeper into historical archives, Blackwood found additional accounts that established a terrifying pattern. Every 50 years, dating back to 1755, similar reports appeared in various locations across the American frontier. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. Three identical girls found in desert locations, speaking in unison, displaying impossible knowledge, and vanishing after precisely 1 month. The 1805 account came from a fur trapper's journal discovered in Missouri Territorial Archives. The 1755 report was buried in colonial records from Pennsylvania, describing three girls found by a surveying expedition who spoke fluent Latin and predicted events that later came to pass with disturbing accuracy. Each historical account mentioned the same phenomena: synchronized behavior, resistance to religious symbols, photographic anomalies when cameras became available, and knowledge that transcended normal human learning. Most disturbing was the consistent pattern of their disappearance, always after exactly 30 days, always without a trace. Blackwood's research revealed an even more troubling detail. Each appearance of the mysterious girls coincided with significant historical events that occurred within the following year. The 1755 sighting preceded major Indian wars. The 1805 discovery came before the New Madrid earthquakes. The 1855 appearance occurred just before violent conflicts that would reshape the Southwest. If the pattern held true, something catastrophic was approaching in 1906. On the morning of September 15, 1905, exactly 30 days after their discovery, the three girls vanished as mysteriously as they had appeared. Samuel Cartwright found the shed empty, with no signs of forced entry, no footprints leading away, and no indication of how three children under constant surveillance had simply ceased to exist. The investigation into their disappearance revealed details that defied rational explanation. Deputy Harrison, who had maintained watch throughout the night, swore that no one had entered or left the building. The single door remained locked from the outside, the windows were too small for human passage, and there were no secret exits or hidden passages in the simple wooden structure. Most unsettling was the discovery that the girls had left behind a message carved into the wooden wall with impossible precision. The text appeared to have been burned into the wood rather than cut, creating letters that seemed to glow with their own inner light. We return when the wheel completes its turning. The harvest of silence approaches. Sheriff Webb organized the most extensive search in the county's history, deploying every available man to scour the desert for any trace of the missing children. The search covered hundreds of square miles of harsh terrain, investigated every possible hiding place, and followed tracks that led nowhere. After 2 weeks of intensive effort, they found nothing except the original burned circle where Cartwright had discovered them, and that circle had grown larger, expanding outward in perfect symmetry. The long-term effects of the girls' presence continued to manifest throughout the following months. Cartwright lost 60% of his cattle to mysterious circumstances, animals that simply wandered away and were never found. The burned circle in the desert expanded slowly but steadily, creating a dead zone where nothing would grow and no animals would venture. Dr. Hartfield documented ongoing health effects among those who had extended contact with the children. Sheriff Webb developed severe insomnia and recurring nightmares about synchronized voices calling his name. Morrison abandoned his photography career entirely, claiming that every image he attempted to create was corrupted by memories of the impossible photographs. Miss Wells suffered perhaps the worst effects. Her once orderly mind became filled with knowledge she had never learned. Fluency in ancient languages, understanding of mathematical concepts beyond her education, and awareness of historical events that hadn't yet occurred. She resigned from teaching and eventually required institutionalization for what doctors diagnosed as severe mental breakdown. Reverend Blackwood maintained detailed correspondence with religious authorities throughout the country, documenting the spiritual disturbances that followed the girls' disappearance. His reports described an increase in unexplained phenomena throughout the region. Livestock born with deformities, crops failing in geometric patterns, and residents reporting dreams of synchronized voices speaking in unknown languages. The official investigation was quietly closed in October 1905, with records sealed by federal authorities who classified the case under provisions of national security. The few documents that remained in local archives were heavily redacted, reducing the entire incident to vague references about unidentified children. An investigation concluded without resolution. True to the pattern Reverend Blackwood had discovered, the year following the girls' appearance brought catastrophe to the American Southwest. The great San Francisco earthquake of April 18, 1906, killed thousands and left the city in ruins. But more disturbing were the reports that emerged from survivors, accounts of children's voices singing in perfect harmony just before the ground began to shake. Similar reports came from across the region throughout 1906. Mining disasters in Colorado, flash floods in New Mexico, and mysterious cattle deaths throughout Texas all featured witness accounts of synchronized singing that preceded the tragedies. The voices were always described in identical terms: young girls singing in perfect unison, melodies that were beautiful and terrible, harmonies that made listeners feel profound unease. The investigation's participants never fully recovered from their encounter with the impossible. Sheriff Webb died in 1908 under mysterious circumstances, found in his office with no signs of violence, but bearing an expression of absolute terror that morticians couldn't erase. Dr. Hartfield abandoned her practice and spent her remaining years in a private asylum, claiming that synchronized heartbeats haunted her dreams. Morrison moved to New York City, seeking anonymity in urban crowds, but continued to report that his photographs were corrupted by images of three girls who appeared in frames where they had never been present. His final letter, discovered after his suicide in 1912, described growing certainty that the girls were watching from inside the spaces between light and shadow. Cartwright sold his ranch in 1907 and moved to California, but the burned circle remained on the land through successive owners. The dead zone continued expanding slowly but steadily, creating a patch of desert where nothing natural could survive. Modern satellite imagery shows the circle still visible today, larger than a football field and perfectly geometric in its sterile precision. The only participant to survive with his sanity intact was Reverend Blackwood, who dedicated the remainder of his life to researching the historical pattern and preparing for the next appearance. His private journals, discovered after his death in 1955, contain detailed predictions about when and where the girls would appear next. According to his calculations, based on the 50-year cycle he had documented, the next appearance should have occurred in 1955. Church records from that year contain scattered reports of three identical girls found in the Nevada desert near atomic testing sites, but these accounts were immediately classified by military authorities and removed from public access. The case of the 1905 Texas triplets remains one of the most thoroughly documented yet completely unexplained mysteries in American history. Despite extensive investigation by multiple professional witnesses, physical evidence that defied scientific analysis, and historical patterns that suggested recurring phenomena, no rational explanation has ever been proposed that accounts for all the observed facts. Modern researchers who have gained access to declassified portions of the case files continue to struggle with evidence that challenges fundamental assumptions about reality. The synchronized physiological responses documented by Dr. Hartfield violate basic principles of medical science. The photographic anomalies recorded by Morrison remain unexplained by experts in optical physics. The linguistic and theological knowledge demonstrated to Reverend Blackwood exceeds anything that should be possible for children of their apparent age. Most troubling is the historical pattern that suggests these appearances are not random events, but part of a larger cycle that spans centuries. If Blackwood's research was accurate, similar manifestations should continue occurring every 50 years, serving as harbingers of catastrophic events that reshape human civilization. The implications for our understanding of reality are staggering. Either multiple professional witnesses across different historical periods were victims of elaborate hoaxes or mass hallucinations, or there exist phenomena that operate outside the natural laws that govern our world. The meticulous documentation and consistent historical patterns make the hoax explanation virtually impossible, leaving us with the far more disturbing possibility that reality itself is more complex and dangerous than we dare imagine. What happened to those three identical girls who spoke in unison and could not be captured by cameras? Were they visitors from some parallel dimension where different physical laws apply? Were they harbingers of cosmic forces that periodically intervene in human affairs? Or were they something even more alien, entities that exist in the spaces between our understanding of possible and impossible? The questions raised by this case challenge everything we believe about the nature of existence. In a world where science can explain quantum mechanics and map human DNA, how do we account for three children who shared a single heartbeat and spoke with knowledge that transcended human learning? Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this mystery is not what happened, but what it suggests about the true nature of reality. If such phenomena can occur and be thoroughly documented, yet remain completely unexplained, what other impossible things might be happening just beyond the edge of our perception? The burned circle in the Texas desert continues to expand, visible from space as a perfectly geometric dead zone where nothing natural can survive. Satellites have recorded the area for decades, documenting its steady growth and registering electromagnetic anomalies that have no scientific explanation. According to Reverend Blackwood's calculations, the next appearance should occur in 2005, exactly 100 years after the original sighting. Researchers and investigators continue to monitor desert regions throughout the American Southwest, waiting for three identical girls to appear again, speaking in unison, carrying knowledge that shouldn't exist, serving as harbingers of changes that will reshape our world in ways we cannot predict or prevent. The mystery of the triplets forces us to confront the possibility that our understanding of reality is fundamentally incomplete. In a universe where three children can share a single heartbeat and speak with the voice of ancient wisdom, what other impossible truths are waiting to be discovered? Are you brave enough to consider that everything you believe about the nature of existence might be wrong? Share this story with others who dare to question the boundaries of the possible. Subscribe to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to accept that some mysteries are better left unsolved. The shadows of history hold more secrets than we dare imagine, and the truth about what's really possible in our world remains hidden just beyond the reach of our limited understanding. What will you do when the impossible appears at your doorstep, speaking in perfect unison, carrying knowledge that challenges everything you thought you knew about reality itself?